You just bought your first car. You remember the exact feeling. Signing the paperwork, the keys in your hand for the first time, that specific new car smell that somehow felt like freedom itself. Most people think of that day as a milestone. A photo. A story you tell at parties. The first real symbol of independence. That's not what it actually was. That day was the first time your brain built a template for how you relate to debt, to monthly payments, to depreciating assets, to the entire emotional experience of spending large amounts of money you don't fully have. And whether that first template was healthy or dangerous, you've been running some version of it on every major purchase you've made since. I've thought about this longer than most people ever will. Not as a theory. As something I've watched happen to myself, to people close to me, one quiet financial habit at a time, traced all the way back to a single afternoon at a dealership. Here's what that first car purchase actually did to your financial future, walk through in the order it actually unfolds, starting with the part you'd expect, and ending with the part almost nobody sees coming until they're 40 and still repeating it. Leave a like. Subscribe, and let's get into it. Almost nobody buys their first car the way they'd approach a financial decision of that size later in life. There's no spreadsheet. No comparison of total cost of ownership. No cooling off period. Instead, there's a feeling. The car looks right. The salesperson is friendly and fluent in urgency. This price is only good today, this model is the last one on the lot, someone else is supposedly interested in it this afternoon. The monthly payment gets framed, deliberately, as the only number that matters, because a monthly number always feels smaller than the total number sitting underneath it. This is not an accident of bad luck. It's the specific, well-documented structure of how vehicles are sold to first-time buyers, and it works because the first-time buyer has no prior experience to compare it against. There's no internal alarm yet that fires when a payment structure is engineered to feel affordable rather than actually be affordable. What fails, assuming this was a uniquely personal lapse in judgment? It wasn't. It was the first time a system specifically designed to convert emotion into a signature met a brain that had never encountered that system before. Almost everyone's first major financial decision gets made this way, not through analysis, but through the feeling of the moment, reinforced by a process built to accelerate exactly that feeling. The car itself was never really the product that day. The decision-making pattern you walked out with was. There's a specific detail about that environment worth naming directly, because it explains why almost nobody walks out of a first car purchase having made a fully rational decision. Dealerships are physically and procedurally designed to keep a buyer inside a single, continuous emotional state, the excitement of test driving, followed immediately by a negotiation conducted in a small office, followed immediately by paperwork, all compressed into a single visit with no built-in pause. A first-time buyer rarely has the experience to recognize that this compression is itself a persuasion tool. Every additional hour spent inside that building increases the odds of signing something slightly worse than what a separated decision would have produced, a fact well understood by the industry, and almost never understood by the person sitting across the desk for the first time. Before that day, debt was likely abstract to you, something your parents dealt with, something mentioned in a personal finance class you weren't paying attention to. After that day, debt became a specific, concrete, monthly feeling. A number that leaves your account on a fixed date every month, whether or not anything good happened that month to earn it. This is the part almost nobody names directly. Your first car loan or lease didn't just finance a vehicle. It calibrated your internal sense of what a normal monthly financial obligation feels like. If that first payment was manageable, proportionate to your income, and paid off on schedule, it built a reference point that made future debt decisions feel similarly disciplined, a mortgage payment assessed carefully, a loan taken only when the math justified it. If that first payment was a stretch, justified in the moment by a raise you were hoping for or overtime you assumed would continue, it built a different reference point, one where financial stretching to afford a lifestyle upgrade feels normal, even expected, because it worked out, or was survived, the first time. The specific danger is that this reference point operates almost entirely below conscious awareness. Nobody sits down years later and thinks, I'm about to overextend myself on this mortgage because my first car loan taught me that stretching is fine. The calibration doesn't announce itself. It just quietly sets the baseline against which every future monthly obligation gets measured, and most people never trace the baseline back to its actual origin. A new car loses a significant percentage of its value within the first year, and a substantial additional percentage within the first 5, regardless of condition, regardless of mileage, regardless of how carefully it's maintained. This isn't a flaw in any specific vehicle. It's the mathematical structure of the entire new car market. Almost nobody explains this clearly to a first-time buyer, and almost nobody feels it in the moment of purchase, because depreciation is invisible at the point of sale. The car looks and smells and drives exactly the same the day after you buy it as the day before. The only thing that's changed is a number on paper you're not looking at. The specific lesson this teaches, silently, is one of the most consequential in the entire story, that it's normal to spend significant money on an asset that's guaranteed to lose value the moment you acquire it. Once that lesson is absorbed as how large purchases work, it becomes much easier, later, to justify other depreciating purchases: the boat, the oversized television financed at 0% interest, the upgraded phone every single year, because the first car already established that watching value disappear in exchange for the experience of ownership is simply the price of having nice things. Compare this to the alternative lesson, learned by the smaller number of first-time buyers who bought a reliable used car instead, that someone else already absorbed the steepest part of the depreciation curve, and the smarter purchase is almost always the one where the loss has already happened to someone else first. That's not a lesson about cars. It's a lesson about how to evaluate literally any large purchase for the rest of a person's life, and it gets absorbed permanently, in one afternoon, usually before the buyer is old enough to fully understand what they just learned. The specific irony is that the emotional pull of a new car and the mathematical case against buying one point in exactly opposite directions, and almost every first-time buyer resolves the tension in favor of the feeling rather than the math. This isn't a failure of intelligence. It's a demonstration of a much broader pattern that shows up throughout a financial life. Given a choice between an option that feels better in the moment and an option that performs better over time, the untrained instinct defaults to the feeling, every time, unless something has specifically trained the instinct to pause and calculate first. The first car is usually the first place that instinct gets tested, and for most people, it's the first place it loses. The sticker price was never the real price, and almost nobody first-time buying a car does the complete math before signing. Insurance costs vary dramatically based on the specific vehicle, and a first-time buyer rarely checks this before falling in love with a particular model. Some vehicles carry insurance premiums that alone can rival the size of the monthly loan payment, a fact that typically surfaces for the first time on the very first insurance bill, while after the purchase is already final. Maintenance costs follow a similar pattern. A vehicle that seemed like an incredible deal at the point of sale can quietly become one of the more expensive decisions of a person's 20s once specialty parts, dealership-only service requirements, or simply the ordinary wear of higher mileage start generating bills that were never part of the original monthly payment calculation. Fuel costs, registration fees, the eventual tires, the eventual brakes, none of these show up in the number a salesperson quotes, and none of them show up in the number a first-time buyer mentally commits to before signing. The gap between what I budgeted for and what this vehicle actually costs to own becomes the first real lesson in a pattern that recurs throughout a financial life. The sticker price of any major purchase, a car, a house, a business, is rarely the true cost, and learning to calculate total cost of ownership rather than purchase price is a skill either built early, through a rough first experience, or built later, at a much higher price. Money committed to a car payment is money that cannot simultaneously be invested, and the specific tragedy of this trade-off is that it's almost completely invisible at the moment it's made. A car payment of a few $100s a month, redirected instead into a modest investment account over the following decades, compounds into a dramatically larger sum than most people intuitively expect, not because the monthly amount is large, but because time and compounding work on money the same way habituation works on a house, slowly, invisibly, until the effect becomes undeniable only after enough years have passed to notice it. Nobody explains this trade-off at the point of sale, because the dealership's incentive is to make the monthly payment feel small, not to make the buyer aware of what else that monthly payment could have become. The entire sales process is optimized to keep attention on the vehicle in front of you, not the invisible alternate future sitting in an index fund you never opened. This doesn't mean every car purchase is a financial mistake. Mobility itself has real value, sometimes essential value. But almost nobody entering that dealership for the first time is shown the actual comparison, and the habit of not asking what else could this money become gets set early, quietly, and tends to repeat itself on every large purchase that follows for years afterward. The specific number that makes this land is worth sitting with for a moment. A modest sum invested consistently every month for 40 years, at a historically reasonable average market return, doesn't just add up, it multiplies, because each year's growth starts compounding on top of the growth from every year before it. The first 10 years look unremarkable. The last 10 years look almost unbelievable. And the specific tragedy of the car payment trade-off is that it's made during exactly the decade, the late teens and 20s, where that money would have had the most possible years left to compound. $1 diverted to a car payment at 20 and $1 diverted to a car payment at 40 are not equivalent decisions, even though they feel identical in the moment. The earlier one costs dramatically more, silently, specifically because of how many years of compounding it forfeits. For many first-time buyers, the car isn't just transportation. It's the first major purchase that functions as a public statement about who they are, a specific, visible signal to friends, coworkers, and strangers about status, taste, and success. This identity attachment is powerful, and it's also expensive, because it establishes a pattern that recurs at every subsequent vehicle purchase, the temptation to buy slightly beyond what's financially comfortable, in service of a version of yourself you want other people to see. The specific mechanism is subtle. The first car sets an internal reference point for what I drive says about me, and every upgrade afterward gets measured against that reference point rather than against actual financial capacity. Someone whose first car quietly overstretched their budget for the sake of image often repeats that exact pattern with every vehicle that follows, each one slightly nicer than strictly necessary, each one justified by the same emotional logic that justified the first one, compounding over a lifetime into a specific, predictable category of lifestyle inflation that traces back to a single afternoon nobody thought mattered this much at the time. This is also the point where social comparison quietly enters the financial picture for the first time. A first car gets shown to friends, parked outside a family gathering, photographed and posted, evaluated, usually silently, sometimes out loud, against what peers are driving. That comparison doesn't end after the first car. It becomes a recurring, largely unconscious benchmark that resurfaces at every future vehicle purchase, every home purchase, every visible marker of financial status for the rest of a person's life, and it traces back to the exact same instinct that made the first car feel like it needed to say something about its owner, rather than simply needing to run reliably and get them from one place to another. Everything up to this point explains the individual pieces, the debt, the depreciation, the credit, the identity. But none of that is actually the reason this story matters. The real reason is coming next, and it's the part almost nobody connects until it's pointed out to them directly, usually decades after the fact. If you've made it this far, you're probably already thinking back to your own first car right now, and that's exactly the right moment to stay for what comes next, because it reframes everything you just read. Stick around. This next part is the one that actually explains why all of this still matters today. Here's the part almost nobody connects until it's pointed out directly. The way you bought your first car is, statistically, close to the way you'll approach every major financial decision for the rest of your life, unless something forces you to consciously interrupt the pattern. The emotional urgency you felt at the dealership, the sense that waiting to think it over might mean losing the opportunity, shows up again during a job offer negotiation, during a home purchase, during an investment decision made under pressure. The comfort level you established with monthly payments that stretched slightly beyond comfortable shows up again in every future loan, because the nervous system doesn't distinguish between a car payment I can technically survive and a mortgage payment I can technically survive. It just recognizes the feeling as familiar, and familiar feels safe, whether or not it actually is. This is why financial advisors who work with people over decades often report a strange consistency. Someone who overextended slightly on their first car tends to overextend slightly on their first house, their first business loan, their first major investment, not because they never learned the lesson, but because the lesson they actually absorbed on that first afternoon wasn't to be careful with debt. It was something quieter and far more durable, a felt sense of what stretching feels like, filed away below conscious memory, ready to be reactivated by any future decision that resembles it emotionally. The reverse is equally true, and equally underappreciated. Someone whose first car purchase was deliberate, researched, comfortably within their means, and paid off ahead of schedule often carries that same discipline forward without ever having to consciously decide to. The template was set early, and every subsequent decision inherited it, quietly, the same way the person who overstretched inherited theirs. Neither group typically remembers the mechanism. They just remember, decades later, that they seem to be naturally careful with money or always seem to overspend a little, as if it were a fixed personality trait rather than a pattern that traces back, with remarkable consistency, to a single signature at a dealership, made by a much younger version of themselves who had no idea how long that afternoon would echo. The car was never really the purchase. The pattern was. None of this happened because anything went uniquely wrong or uniquely right. It happens simply because the first time your brain encounters a large financial decision, it builds a template, and that template, whether healthy or not, tends to run quietly in the background of every large decision that follows. The car you bought shaped you more than almost anything you actively noticed happening in the years afterward. You don't need to remember the specific terms of your first auto loan for this to apply to you. The mechanism is the same wherever a first financial experience gets absorbed without examination, a first credit card, a first paycheck spent without a plan, a first large purchase made on emotion rather than arithmetic. The car is just the clearest, most common example of something quieter that's still shaping decisions in your life right now. Notice the financial habits you've stopped questioning. Notice the comfort level with debt you never consciously chose. Notice the parts of your relationship with money that are quietly running on a template set decades ago, by someone who didn't yet know what they were building. Leave a like if this made you think back to your own first car differently. Subscribe, there's more coming that most channels never think to ask. Notice the pattern before it quietly makes one more decision for you. See you in the next one.